The hall was buzzing with quiet excitement. Rows of chairs were filled with people leaning forward, some whispering to their neighbors, others tapping fingers on the seats in anticipation. The lights were bright, reflecting off the polished floor and the shiny grand piano on stage. At that very moment, a young woman was standing behind the heavy curtain, her heart beating faster than ever before. She had been preparing for this day for months, yet the nerves refused to leave her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the straps of her simple dress. It wasn't a fancy outfit, nothing meant to draw attention, because she believed that the music should speak for itself, not her clothes. She had grown up in a small town, where the streets were quiet and the houses were close together. From a very young age, she had been drawn to the piano. Her mother had told her stories of how, as a little girl, she would crawl onto the piano bench, her tiny fingers barely reaching the keys, and tap out little tunes she had made up in her mind. People around her thought it was cute at first, just a hobby, something children do. But her passion grew with her, and soon it wasn't just cute anymore, it was a part of her life, as necessary as breathing. Despite her talent, she had always been shy. She would play in her room for hours, letting the music carry her away. But performing in front of others was a different challenge. She had done small recitals at school and local events, but nothing like this. This was a stage where judges, known for their strict critiques, sat ready with pens in hand, prepared to point out even the smallest mistake. The pressure was immense, but she reminded herself of the reason she had come here in the first place, not to impress anyone, but to share her music. Her mind wandered briefly to the moment she had received the invitation. She had been cleaning tables at a small cafe when a letter arrived, hand-delivered, sealed with a ribbon. At first she thought it was a mistake. Why would anyone notice someone like her, someone who spent more time daydreaming than talking to people? But the letter had explained that she had been recommended for a special performance, a chance to play on a real stage in front of experienced judges and an audience. It was an opportunity that many dreamers only imagined. And now, standing behind the curtain, she could hardly believe it was happening. She could hear the muffled claps of the previous performer finishing their piece. The audience was settling back into their seats, and the soft murmur of conversation faded as the stage manager gave her a nod. It was her turn. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and run, to escape into the safety of the backstage area. But she didn't. She stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Each step felt heavy, but she kept moving. As she reached the piano, she paused. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, feeling the cool surface beneath her skin. The grand piano seemed enormous to her, almost intimidating. She had practiced on smaller keyboards at home, but this was different. The sound that came from this instrument could fill a room, reach the farthest corners of the audience, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. She glanced at the judges, who were already looking at her with curious eyes. Some of them seemed skeptical. Perhaps they were thinking that she was too young, too inexperienced to perform anything memorable. A few faces carried polite smiles, but behind them was the critical gaze of professionals who had seen hundreds of performers. She took another deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to center herself. The world outside the stage faded away. It was just her and the piano, just the melody waiting to come alive through her fingers. Her first note sounded soft, almost shy, as if testing the room, measuring the air, and finding its place. She had been asked to play a simple melody, something many would consider easy, but she knew that simplicity could be dangerous. A simple melody could reveal every mistake, every hesitation, every insecurity. She had to be precise, but also let the music breathe. Let it tell the story she had carried in her heart for years. The first few measures flowed carefully. She reminded herself not to rush, not to let her nervousness take over. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, but with each note she felt a little more in control. The audience was silent, waiting, listening. Some leaned closer, curious about this quiet girl with a soft voice of music. They didn't know yet that what seemed ordinary would soon become something unforgettable. Her mind drifted to her past, to the small moments that had shaped her love for music. She thought about the nights she spent under dim lights, fingers moving clumsily over the keys, learning by trial and error. She remembered the encouragement of a teacher who had once told her that talent was not just in hitting the right notes, but in feeling the music, living it with every part of oneself. She had kept that advice close, letting it guide her through countless hours of practice. And then there were the moments of doubt. The times she felt she wasn't good enough, that no one would ever notice her music, that maybe she should focus on something more practical. But the piano had a voice she could not ignore. Even when the world seemed indifferent, even when she felt invisible, the music spoke to her. It reminded her that she had something worth sharing, and that she owed it to herself to keep playing. The young woman took another deep breath and allowed herself to be present in the moment. The stage lights were warm on her skin. The polished wood of the piano gleamed under the lights, and the audience's eyes were fixed on her. She felt a strange mix of fear and excitement, a cocktail of emotions that made her fingers tremble slightly. But she didn't stop. She reminded herself she was not here to be perfect, she was here to be true to herself. As the first few notes lingered in the hall, she noticed a subtle shift. The audience began to lean in, no longer polite, but genuinely attentive. She could see a few heads tilt slightly, as if trying to catch every nuance of the music. Even the judges, who had seemed distant at first, now had a hint of curiosity in their eyes. She felt a tiny spark of confidence. Maybe, just maybe, she could reach them. The melody continued, flowing from her hands with a gentle grace. She allowed herself to close her eyes briefly, feeling the music rather than thinking about it. Every chord, every pause, every small flourish was a conversation with the audience, a sharing of something deeply personal. The stage was no longer intimidating. It had become a space where she could express herself freely, where the piano and her heart spoke together. Even in those early moments, she could sense the change. The nervousness was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. The audience was quiet, listening intently, drawn into a story that she had not fully realized she was telling. The simple melody had begun to transform in her hands, revealing depth and emotion that no one could have expected. She thought about all the people who had doubted her, all the quiet whispers that said she might never make it. They didn't matter now. She was on stage playing music that came from the very core of her being. Every note was a piece of her journey, every pause a reflection of her struggles and triumphs. She realized that the power of music was not in impressing others, but in expressing truth. The first part of her performance came to an end, soft and delicate. She allowed the notes to linger just a moment longer, savoring the sound as it faded into silence. The audience remained still, as if unsure how to respond. There were no claps yet, only a quiet anticipation, a sense that something remarkable was unfolding. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting the judges for a brief instant. Some of them raised their eyebrows, a hint of surprise in their expressions. She didn't need their approval. She only needed to continue, to let the next part of the melody take her further. As she readied herself for the next section, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. She was no longer just a nervous girl behind a curtain. She was a musician, a storyteller, a person capable of touching hearts with something as simple as a melody. The journey was just beginning, but in that first moment on stage, she had already discovered something important. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it, and so, with her hands poised above the keys and her heart full of determination, she prepared to let the music continue, ready to transform the simple melody into something unforgettable. The audience waited, and she knew that she was ready to take them on a journey they would never forget. As the first soft notes of the simple melody lingered in the hall, she felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The initial tension had started to fade, replaced by a focused calm. Her fingers moved more confidently across the keys, guided by years of practice and an instinct she could not quite explain. It was as if the piano itself was speaking through her, and she was merely the medium for the music to flow. Every sound seemed to fill the room, reaching the far corners where people sat quietly, listening with rapt attention. The audience, who had been politely observing, began to lean in, drawn by the subtle beauty of her touch. She noticed small signs of interest, the slight nods, the tilted heads, the soft gasps when a particularly delicate chord resonated. Even the judges, who had initially looked reserved and detached, were watching her closely now. Their pens were still in hand, ready to take notes, but their expressions had softened. Curiosity had replaced skepticism, and a spark of anticipation glimmered in their eyes. She had been told to play a simple melody, and at first, she followed the sheet music exactly. The melody was gentle, familiar, and almost predictable, but as she progressed, she felt an impulse to add little variations, subtle touches that made the notes feel alive. She shifted the tempo slightly in places, letting some notes linger longer than written, and softened others to create a delicate contrast. The music was no longer just a melody. It was beginning to tell a story, one that was unfolding in real time, with each nuance carefully placed to convey emotion. Her mind briefly wandered back to her early lessons, where her teacher had emphasized the importance of feeling the music, rather than simply playing it correctly. Those lessons had been repetitive and sometimes frustrating, but they had instilled in her a deep understanding of expression. Every practice session, every mistake, every late night spent alone at the piano had brought her to this moment. She realized now that all of that effort was not about perfection. It was about honesty, about connecting with anyone willing to listen. The simple melody she was playing had started to capture the room. Each note seemed to carry a weight that went beyond the obvious simplicity of the song. She could feel the energy of the audience responding to her, a quiet electricity that made her pulse quicken. It was a strange sensation, knowing that people she did not even know were feeling something real through her music. It was humbling yet exhilarating, and it gave her the courage to play with more freedom. She began to notice small details about the hall she had not seen before. The way the light reflected off the polished wooden floor, the subtle movements of the audience as they leaned forward, the way the judges exchanged small glances with one another. All of it became part of the experience. Music, she realized, was not just sound. It was a connection, a bridge between people, and in that moment the bridge was forming under her fingertips. With every measure, she allowed herself to explore the melody more deeply. She added gentle crescendos in places where the music seemed to demand emotion, and softened her touch where a quieter moment would speak louder than a strong note. The simple melody, which could have felt ordinary in another context, was now taking on layers of meaning. It was as if she was speaking without words, sharing a piece of her soul with everyone in the room. She thought briefly about the people who had influenced her journey. Her family had always supported her quietly, never demanding anything, simply providing encouragement and space to practice. Friends had sometimes doubted her, thinking music could never be a serious path, but she had continued anyway, driven by an inner conviction. Every challenge she had faced, moments of self-doubt, times when her fingers fumbled, days when she felt she was not improving, had prepared her for this moment. She was not performing just for the judges. She was performing for all those who had shaped her, for herself and for the music itself. The judges, who had begun the performance with polite attention, were now fully engaged. One of them leaned forward, resting an elbow on the desk, his pen forgotten. Another tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on the pianist's hands as they moved with precision and grace. Even though she could not see their faces clearly from where she sat, she could feel the shift in the energy of the room. The polite listening had turned into something more profound, anticipation, curiosity, and admiration. As she continued, she felt her own emotions rising. She thought about the struggles and joys of her life, the moments that had taught her about patience, resilience, and hope. She let those feelings flow through her fingers, shaping the melody in subtle ways. A soft chord here became wistful. A gentle arpeggio there became full of longing. She realized that the beauty of music was not just in the notes themselves, but in the intention and emotion behind them. It was a language beyond words, capable of conveying what speech often could not. The audience responded quietly at first, leaning in, their breaths held, absorbing every subtle change in the performance. She could feel their attention like a gentle pressure, urging her to continue, to explore deeper, to let the music speak freely. She felt a small thrill in knowing that her efforts were not going unnoticed. The experience was not about applause yet. It was about the connection, the silent understanding that music can create. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully immerse in the moment. She closed her eyes briefly, letting her memory and intuition guide her fingers. Each chord was deliberate, each note carefully considered. The simple melody was evolving under her hands, gaining a richness and depth that made it something more than anyone had expected. She was no longer just following sheet music. She was telling a story, and the story was her own. She noticed a slight smile from a judge as the melody developed, a small but meaningful sign of approval. That tiny gesture gave her a boost of confidence, but she remained focused. She did not want to perform for approval. She wanted to perform for truth. She wanted the audience to feel what she felt, to experience the emotions that had been part of her life journey, distilled into sound. The realization was empowering. It reminded her why she had spent so many hours alone at the piano, learning, practicing, and growing. As the melody continued, she became aware of the subtle reactions in the audience. A young child was sitting on a parent's lap, eyes wide with fascination. An older couple held hands, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Each person was engaging with the music in their own way, and it struck her how universal this connection was. Music had no language barrier. It required no explanation. It simply existed, and through it, she could reach anyone willing to listen. Her fingers moved with a newfound confidence now. She added small flourishes, soft trills, and gentle pauses that made the melody breathe. It was still the same simple piece she had been asked to play, but now it carried her personality, her emotions, and her heart. She felt a thrill of joy in knowing that she had the power to transform something ordinary into something extraordinary. Each note became an expression of who she was, and for the first time, she realized that her music could leave an imprint on others. The judges were leaning forward, fully engaged now. Some of them scribbled notes furiously, but their faces betrayed admiration. It was as if they were witnessing something rare, a talent that went beyond technique, reaching into the realm of artistry. She could feel their attention as a gentle current, pushing her to explore further, to give everything she had in that moment. The performance had become a dialogue, a shared experience between herself and everyone in the hall. She could feel her own heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of the melody. There was a calmness in that synchronization, a sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. All the years of practice, all the small sacrifices, all the moments of doubt, they had led her to this precise moment on this stage, with the audience and the judges listening intently. She understood now that music was not just performance. It was presence. It was being fully there, fully engaged, fully herself. The melody began to flow more freely, yet remained anchored in its gentle simplicity. She found herself exploring dynamics she had never considered before, letting the soft parts whisper and the slightly louder chords sing. She realized that even within simplicity there was endless possibility. Every small change could evoke a different feeling, a different memory, a different emotion in those listening. It was a power she had long felt in practice, but now experienced fully in reality. As the first half of the melody reached its natural pause, she allowed the notes to fade into silence. The hall was quiet, a collective breath held as if the audience was savoring the sound before letting it go. She opened her eyes, and in that brief moment, she caught glimpses of faces softened by emotion, heads nodding ever so slightly in appreciation, eyes glistening with unspoken admiration. Even the judges, who had remained composed throughout, seemed momentarily moved. The young woman took a deep breath, letting the pause settle in, feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. The simple melody had begun to reveal its hidden depth under her hands, and she had felt the first true connection with the audience. It was not yet complete, but the seed had been planted. She knew, deep in her heart, that the rest of the performance could take this connection even further. She was no longer just playing notes, she was telling a story that only music could tell. She let her hands rest lightly on the keys for a moment, savoring the stillness before continuing into the next phase of the melody. The journey was far from over, but she had already taken the first step into something larger than herself, something that might linger in the hearts of those listening long after the final note had faded. The simple melody, which had begun so quietly and carefully, started to transform under her fingers. She could feel it herself as she played, a shift happening within the music, a life of its own. The notes were no longer just a set of instructions on a page. They had become a story, a conversation, an expression of something deep and personal. She didn't plan it, she didn't need to. It was happening naturally, as if the piano and her emotions were merging into one. The audience was beginning to feel it too. At first, they had been politely listening, expecting a pleasant but ordinary performance. Now there was a subtle change in the energy of the room. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, some holding their breath. They could sense the depth of feeling behind every chord, the subtle shifts in tempo, the gentle rise and fall of the melody that seemed to echo human emotions itself. It was as though she were telling a story with no words, and everyone could understand it perfectly. She felt herself becoming lost in the music. Each note guided the next, and her hands moved with a fluid confidence she had never experienced before on stage. Her fingers flew across the keys, not hurriedly but with intention and grace. A chord that seemed simple on paper became rich and layered, carrying hints of sadness, hope, longing, and joy all at once. The audience responded unconsciously, their faces softening, some closing their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Even the younger children in the audience, who usually fidgeted or whispered, sat still, captivated by the flow of the music. The judges, who had been observing with professional detachment at first, could no longer hide their astonishment. One of them leaned forward, elbows on the desk, mouth slightly open as though trying to contain the shock of what they were hearing. Another tilted her head, eyes focused intently on the young woman's hands, tracing the movements with curiosity and admiration. It was not just a performance, they were witnessing the unfolding of an artist's soul, and the depth of expression was far beyond what they had anticipated from someone who had been asked to play a simple melody. She had reached a part of the melody where she could let her feelings fully shape the notes. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing memories and emotions to guide her hands. She remembered moments of struggle, nights spent practicing in solitude, and the small victories that had kept her going. She thought of the times she had doubted herself, the days when she questioned if all her effort was worth it. All those experiences were now being transformed into sound, giving the melody a new dimension. The audience could feel it too, even if they didn't understand exactly what was happening. Music has a way of bypassing words, of speaking directly to the heart, and that is what was happening now. The simple melody had become a living thing, rising and falling with emotion, at times gentle, at times intense, yet always flowing naturally. Some people in the crowd glanced at one another, eyes wide, as if silently acknowledging, "This is something extraordinary." She noticed that her own heart had begun to match the rhythm of the piece. The nervousness that had gripped her at the start was gone, replaced by a serene focus. Every movement of her hands was deliberate, every touch on the keys intentional. It was no longer about playing for the judges, the audience, or even herself. It was about letting the music speak, allowing the melody to grow and evolve in its own time. She was simply the vessel, letting the story flow through her fingers. The simple melody began to shift into something more complex, though still recognizable. She added gentle embellishments here and there, subtle flourishes that enhanced the emotion without breaking the essence of the piece. A chord that had seemed soft and timid now carried a gentle strength. A pause that was written as a short break in the music became a moment of reflection, almost a heartbeat in the flow of sound. The audience felt every change, even if they could not articulate it. They were absorbed, mesmerized, transported by the power of a melody they thought they already knew. She glanced briefly at the judges, though she did not look for approval. She just wanted to see their reactions, to feel the shared connection that was forming. One judge's eyes were slightly moist, another's lips parted in astonishment. The youngest judge, who had appeared critical at first, now had a faint smile, a spark of wonder in his gaze. They had expected a simple, ordinary performance, and what they were witnessing was something beyond expectation, something that revealed the raw, unfiltered emotion of an artist. Her mind drifted to the countless hours she had spent at the piano alone. There had been days when her fingers ached, when she questioned if she would ever improve, when the loneliness of practice felt overwhelming. She had pushed through those moments, driven by a quiet love for the instrument and the music it produced. Now on this stage, she could see why every moment of doubt and persistence had mattered. Each note she played carried the weight of that effort, that dedication, and it resonated with every person listening. The melody had begun to rise and fall in unexpected ways. She allowed herself to take small risks, to let her emotions guide the timing of each chord. Some notes lingered longer than expected, creating a feeling of suspense and anticipation. Others were quick and light, bringing a playful contrast that made the music feel alive. The audience felt it instinctively, leaning in, eyes widening, hearts beating faster. The room was no longer just a hall. It had become a shared space of emotion, where each person was connected by the language of sound. She could feel a sense of exhilaration building within her. For the first time on stage, she felt fully free. She was not concerned with mistakes, with judgment, or with outcome. She was completely immersed in the music, letting it carry her wherever it wanted to go. Each note became a conversation, each chord a message, each pause a breath in a larger story. She realized that this was what it meant to perform, to surrender to the music completely, and to trust that it would reach the hearts of those listening. The audience responded in subtle ways. Some leaned forward, holding their breath, trying to capture every nuance. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, feeling the emotions as if they were their own. Even the skeptics, those who had doubted a simple melody could captivate, were visibly moved. You could sense the collective realization forming in the room. What they were hearing was extraordinary, and it was coming from someone who had been underestimated. The judges could no longer remain impartial. One of them whispered something to another, their heads close together, and for a moment they seemed like ordinary spectators, caught up in the beauty of the performance. Another judge's pen hovered in the air, forgotten, as he watched the pianist's hands move with such precision and emotional depth. The quiet awe in the room was palpable. They had expected a simple, pleasant performance, and instead, they were witnessing artistry, talent, and emotion that went beyond what could be written in any score. She allowed herself to smile slightly as she continued. The melody was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone in the room. It was a shared experience, a bridge connecting hearts through sound. She felt their emotions as clearly as her own, a collective pulse that rose and fell with the music. The simple melody was alive, breathing through her and the audience simultaneously, creating a moment that none of them would ever forget. Her confidence grew with every note. She began to experiment subtly, letting her intuition guide her. She added delicate trills, gentle pauses, and expressive dynamics that transformed the melody into something more profound. It was no longer just a piece of music, it was a narrative, a story without words, an emotional journey that drew the audience in completely. Even the smallest gestures of her fingers on the keys seemed to carry weight, meaning, and beauty. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the small practice rooms, the quiet nights, the doubts, and the moments of triumph. Every experience, every struggle had shaped her into this moment, giving her the courage and skill to express herself fully. She realized that the beauty of music was not only in technical skill but in authenticity, in the ability to let the heart guide the hands, and in sharing that heart with others. The melody rose to a gentle climax, flowing with emotion and grace. The audience felt the tension and release, the softness and strength, all within a few simple notes. Some held their breath, some felt tears welling up, and some simply sat in awe, completely immersed. Even the judges, who had seen countless performances in their careers, were speechless, caught up in the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. As the melody continued to evolve, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had begun with fear and uncertainty, and now she was completely in her element. Every note was a testament to her dedication, her love for music, and her willingness to let herself be vulnerable on stage. She realized that this was the true magic of performance. Not the applause, not the recognition, but the ability to touch others through honesty and emotion. The audience remained captivated, hanging on each note. They could feel the transformation of the melody, the depth of feeling behind it, and the extraordinary talent of the young pianist. The judges, too, were fully absorbed, their expressions a mix of astonishment and admiration. They had expected simplicity, and instead, they were witnessing something profound, something that would stay with them long after the performance ended. The young woman's hands continued to move across the keys with a confidence that had grown with every note. The melody, which had begun as something quiet and ordinary, had transformed into something extraordinary. She could feel it now, a current of emotion running through her fingertips as if the piano itself was alive and responding to her heart. Every note, every chord, every pause was charged with feeling, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would come next. The audience had become utterly silent. The polite murmurs and shifting in seats from earlier were gone. All eyes were fixed on her and the piano, but it was not just the young woman they were watching. It was the story she was telling without words. Each note reached into the hearts of the listeners, carrying a subtle power they could feel but could not describe. The simple melody had become a language of emotions, connecting the audience to the pianist in ways that words could never achieve. She felt a strange sense of freedom as she continued. The nerves and fear that had gripped her at the start of the performance had completely melted away, replaced by a sense of calm purpose. Her mind was clear, her heart focused, and her hands moved instinctively. She was no longer thinking about how the judges might react or whether the audience would enjoy the performance. She was thinking only of the music, letting it flow naturally, letting it tell the story she had carried inside for so many years. The judges, who had initially looked detached and critical, were now leaning forward, utterly captivated. One of them placed a hand over his mouth, unable to hide the surprise and admiration in his eyes. Another's eyes glistened slightly, betraying the emotional effect the music was having. Even the youngest judge, who had appeared skeptical at first, now had a look of awe, his pen resting forgotten on the desk. It was as though they had all been transported into the music itself, caught in a moment that they would never forget. She let herself close her eyes for a brief moment, trusting her intuition completely. The melody had become more expressive now, with subtle changes in tempo, dynamics, and phrasing that brought out its full depth. She allowed pauses to linger just a little longer, letting the sound resonate in the hall, giving the audience a moment to breathe and feel the music. She added delicate touches to certain chords, tiny flourishes that seemed almost improvised, yet perfectly suited to the emotion she wanted to convey. The audience was responding, though quietly. A soft gasp here, a barely perceptible nod there, a tear forming in someone's eye. They were all caught up in the unfolding magic. Some people held their breath, afraid to interrupt the spell, while others leaned forward, trying to capture every nuance. Even those who had been skeptical or indifferent at the beginning of the performance could no longer deny the power of what they were hearing. The simple melody had become something alive, and the audience felt it in their very bones. She could feel the momentum building. The first part of the performance had been gentle and careful, the second part more expressive, and now she was entering the most intense section. Her fingers moved with speed and precision, yet every movement was guided by emotion, not by force. She allowed herself to explore the melody fully, to let it expand and contract, rise and fall, whisper and shout, all in a delicate balance. The sound was no longer just notes on a page. It was a living, breathing story unfolding in real time. Her thoughts briefly drifted to all the moments that had brought her here. The long nights of practice, the times she had struggled to get a chord just right, the days when she had doubted her own ability. Each of these moments had been essential. They had shaped her, taught her patience, and given her the depth of feeling she now poured into the music. She realized that every small effort, every tear shed in solitude, had led to this extraordinary connection with the audience. The judges were now completely absorbed. They had seen countless performances in their careers, yet none had affected them quite like this. The simple melody, transformed by her hands and heart, had become something beyond technical skill. It was pure artistry. One judge leaned back slightly, exhaling softly as if trying to process the beauty of what they were hearing. Another had tears brimming in their eyes, struggling to maintain the professional composure required in such settings. The audience could sense their reactions, and it only amplified the emotional resonance of the music. She felt a surge of courage and joy. The music had taken her to a place she had never known on stage. She was no longer simply performing. She was communicating something profound, something universal. Every note seemed to carry a piece of her soul, and she could feel the invisible threads connecting her to everyone listening. The room was no longer just an auditorium. It had become a shared space of emotion where every heartbeat, every breath, and every subtle movement was part of the experience. Her hands moved faster now, yet with grace and control. She allowed herself to experiment with subtle variations, adding a gentle ripple here, a soft flourish there. The melody soared, not in loudness but in intensity and emotion. The audience felt it deeply, their bodies swaying slightly, some holding their chests as though the music had reached inside and touched something hidden. The piano had become an extension of her feelings, and the audience was responding not just to sound, but to the honesty and vulnerability she poured into each note. A few moments of silence punctuated the music, giving weight to certain phrases. She knew that these pauses were as important as the notes themselves. Each silent moment allowed the audience to reflect, to absorb, and to feel the emotional journey that she was guiding them through. She could feel the energy of the room, the collective focus and anticipation, and it pushed her to give even more, to continue sharing every ounce of expression she had. She noticed subtle reactions from the audience members. Some had tears welling up, some had wide eyes of amazement, and others had small smiles that spoke of joy and wonder. She didn't need to look at them. She could feel the connection in the air, a shared understanding that this moment was extraordinary. Every person was listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. And it was a feeling she had never experienced on stage before. The judges, now fully engaged, exchanged glances with one another, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had expected a simple, unremarkable performance, and what they were witnessing was far beyond that. It was artistry, emotion, and technical skill all intertwined, yet the most striking thing was the authenticity. The young woman was not performing for approval or praise. She was performing because the music demanded honesty, and every listener could feel it. The intensity of the melody continued to build, rising and falling with natural flow, carrying the audience along with it. She allowed herself to be completely present, letting intuition guide her hands, letting emotion shape each note. She played with a depth and subtlety that made the familiar melody feel brand new, as if it had been born again through her performance. Every chord, every pause, every flourish was deliberate yet effortless, a perfect balance of skill and heart. The audience remained silent, enraptured. They could feel the transformation of the melody, the depth of expression, and the connection forming between themselves and the performer. Even those who had come expecting to hear a simple tune were now fully invested, drawn into the evolving story that the music was telling. The room seemed to vibrate with emotion, an invisible current linking everyone together, and the young woman could feel it as clearly as she could feel the keys beneath her fingers. The judges were now leaning forward, completely absorbed. Their pens had fallen forgotten to the desks, their eyes fixed intently on the pianist. They were no longer evaluating, they were witnessing. One judge's hand trembled slightly as they clutched the edge of the table, a subtle sign of the profound impact of the performance. Another had tears rolling quietly down their cheeks, overcome by the unexpected beauty and depth of what they were hearing. The young woman played on, unaware of the magnitude of their reactions, lost in the music herself. She felt a quiet satisfaction as the music continued. She had begun the performance with uncertainty and nerves, and now she was fully in her element. Each note carried her past struggles, her small victories, her dedication, and her love for music. She realized that true artistry was not about perfection. It was about honesty, emotion, and the willingness to share a piece of oneself with others. The melody had become a vessel for all of that, and she could see the effect it had on everyone listening. As the climax of this part of the performance approached, she allowed herself to push the boundaries just slightly, exploring the intensity of the music. Her fingers moved with speed and precision, yet every movement was guided by feeling. The melody rose and fell like waves, carrying the audience along with it. They were no longer passive listeners, they were part of the story, immersed in the emotions conveyed through sound. The simple tune had become a living, breathing entity, a shared experience between the young woman and everyone in the room. She could feel the impact of her performance in real time. The judges were captivated, the audience enraptured, and even she felt transformed. The music had taken her to a place she had never experienced before, a place where skill, emotion, and authenticity merged. She realized that this was what performance truly meant: connection, expression, and the ability to touch others in ways words could never achieve. As the notes lingered in the hall, she prepared herself for the final section of the performance. The intensity had reached its peak, yet there was still more to express. She allowed herself a deep breath, steadying her hands and heart, ready to bring the melody to its conclusion. The audience remained utterly silent, waiting, captivated, and ready to witness the final transformation of the simple tune that had become something extraordinary. As the final notes of the melody echoed through the hall, a silence unlike any other hung in the air. It was not the quiet that comes before applause, nor the stillness of a room waiting for something to happen. It was a silence filled with awe, with disbelief, with an unspoken understanding that what had just occurred was extraordinary. The young woman's fingers lingered on the keys for a moment, as if reluctant to let the music end. And then slowly, gently, she lifted her hands. The last note faded into a hushed resonance, leaving the audience suspended in the magic of the moment. She opened her eyes and looked at the room. Faces turned toward her with expressions that seemed almost frozen in astonishment. Some eyes glistened with tears, Some mouths hung slightly open, and a few people pressed their hands to their chests as if the music had touched something deep within them. Even the children, who often became restless at performances, were sitting completely still, captivated by what they had witnessed. The simple melody she had been asked to play had become something unforgettable, a shared experience that left everyone changed in some way. The judges were no exception. They sat in stunned silence, their usual composure entirely gone. One of them, the eldest, slowly lifted a hand to his face, blinking as though trying to clear his vision. Another had both hands on the desk, leaning forward, completely absorbed, eyes wide with admiration and surprise. The third, who had seemed skeptical from the start, now had tears welling in their eyes, struggling to maintain the professional detachment expected of them. They had seen countless performances in their lives, yet they had never witnessed anything like this, something so simple yet so profoundly moving. The audience began to shift, a quiet murmur of recognition and appreciation spreading through the hall. It started as a few hesitant claps and then grew steadily, until the entire room was clapping, cheering, and even whistling in amazement. The sound was not just applause, it was a collective acknowledgement of something remarkable. People were not clapping simply because the performance was good. They were clapping because it had touched their hearts, because it had reminded them of the power of true expression, of the beauty that can emerge from authenticity and courage. The young woman remained seated for a moment, catching her breath and letting the applause wash over her. Her heart was racing, not with nervousness this time, but with a combination of relief, joy, and pride. She had faced her fears, overcome her doubts, and shared something deeply personal with the world. The response of the audience and the judges was more than she could have imagined. She realized that her journey, all the hard work, the long hours, and even the moments of self-doubt had led to this singular, unforgettable experience. She finally stood, her hands lightly touching the piano for one last time before stepping back. The applause intensified, and she could feel the energy of the room lifting her spirits. People were rising from their seats, giving standing ovations and calling out words of praise. Some were wiping away tears, others were exchanging amazed looks, and many were simply smiling, overwhelmed by the emotions the music had stirred. It was a moment of pure connection, where performer and audience were linked by something greater than words, greater than expectation. The judges began to regain their composure slowly, as if waking from a trance. The head judge cleared their throat, their voice shaking slightly with emotion as they finally spoke. I have never heard anything like this in all my years," they said. "What you have just performed was not merely a simple melody. It was a journey, a story, a masterpiece. Your ability to take something so modest and transform it into something so profound is extraordinary." Another judge nodded, tears glistening in their eyes, and added, "The depth of feeling, the precision, the honesty. You have moved every single person in this hall. We came expecting a simple performance, and we have been completely transformed. This is a rare gift, and it deserves to be shared with the world." The third judge, who had been quiet until now, spoke last, their voice steady but full of emotion. "You have reminded us all why we come to music in the first place, not for perfection, not for technical skill alone, but for connection, for truth, for the ability to touch hearts. Thank you for that gift." The young woman felt a warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of humility and pride. She had not performed for recognition or praise. She had performed to be true to herself and to the music. And now, in this moment, she realized that being true to oneself was more powerful than she could have imagined. The recognition from the judges, the admiration from the audience, and the shared emotion were all reflections of her honesty and dedication. As people began to approach the stage, offering congratulations and words of admiration, she remained composed yet deeply moved. She shook hands with the judges, receiving heartfelt compliments and encouragement. Strangers came up to her, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for sharing the music, for expressing emotions they could not put into words themselves. Each interaction reminded her of the power of what she had created. Not just sound, but connection, empathy, and understanding. Her mind wandered back to the quiet practice rooms, to the nights spent alone with the piano, to the moments of doubt when she had questioned her path. All of those experiences had prepared her for this day. She realized that every hour of effort, every small triumph, and every struggle had led to this moment of triumph, where her talent and her heart had touched the lives of so many people at once. She looked around the hall one last time, taking in the expressions of joy, awe, and admiration. The people were no longer just spectators. They were participants in the music, connected to her and to one another by the beauty of the performance. It was a shared experience that transcended age, background, and expectation. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for the opportunity to perform, but for the ability to express herself in a way that resonated with others so deeply. The stage manager approached, offering a small, proud smile, and whispered, "You were amazing. Everyone will remember this performance." She nodded, feeling a mix of humility and satisfaction. She knew that the memory of this day would stay with her forever, not just because of the applause, but because of the connection, the shared emotion, and the realization that she had truly expressed herself in the most genuine way possible. Even as the audience began to leave, still talking about the performance in hushed, awed voices, she remained for a few moments alone on the stage, letting the silence sink in. She touched the keys lightly one last time, feeling the echoes of the music linger. It was a quiet, private moment, a way to honor the journey she had taken to arrive at this point. She felt complete, fulfilled, and ready for whatever came next. Later, as she walked backstage and removed herself from the intensity of the spotlight, she reflected on what had happened. This performance was more than just a display of skill. It was a testament to perseverance, passion, and the courage to share one's true self. She realized that talent alone was not enough. It was the heart behind the talent, the honesty, and the willingness to be vulnerable that made the music extraordinary. In the days and weeks that followed, invitations to perform came from all directions. Concert halls, music festivals, and private events reached out, drawn by the story of the young woman who had taken a simple melody and turned it into something unforgettable. Yet, despite all the recognition and praise, she remained humble. She understood that the true reward was not fame or accolades. It was the ability to touch others, to create a moment of shared emotion that would linger long after the music had ended. She continued to practice, to explore new pieces, to refine her technique, and to grow as a musician. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned on that stage. That simplicity, when combined with honesty and emotion, could become extraordinary. Every note she played, every melody she created, carried the memory of that performance, the feeling of awe and connection that had been forged in that hall. Even years later, when she thought back to that day, she could feel the electricity of the audience, the astonishment of the judges, and the quiet, powerful joy that came from sharing something deeply personal. It was a reminder that music was not just about skill or training. It was about courage, heart, and the willingness to speak one's truth through sound. And so, the simple melody that had begun with hesitation and uncertainty had completed its journey. It had grown into something profound, something that would be remembered not just for its notes, but for the emotions it carried, the connections it created, and the young woman who had dared to let her heart guide her hands. She had faced the stage, faced her fears, and in doing so, had created a moment of pure, unforgettable beauty, a moment that would remain in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it forever. She left the hall that evening with a quiet smile, a sense of fulfillment, and the knowledge that she had given her best. The applause, the accolades, and the astonished faces were all part of the experience.